The morning of my son's graduation unfolded like a long exhale I had held for years without noticing. Light pushed through the curtains with a softness that felt almost foreign, as if the day itself was trying to ease the weight I carried in my chest. I stood in front of the mirror, the same one I had used countless times before work, before parent-teacher meetings, before signing papers at the lawyer's office during the divorce. This time, the reflection staring back at me felt exposed, as though the fabric of my life had been stitched into my skin, and today would be a day where every thread could be seen by anyone who cared to look closely. Choosing what to wear became an unexpected journey through memories. A dress that once made me feel elegant suddenly reminded me of a night I spent waiting alone at the foot of the hospital bed where my son recovered from a fever. A blouse I loved once brought back the sound of my ex-husband's condescension when he said I looked tired no matter what. My hands lingered on each fabric as if I were touching the years themselves. Years when I worked double shifts, rushed buses, missed meals, fought tears on silent nights, and kept going because quitting wasn't an option. Today was supposed to be about celebrating my son's achievement, but as the minutes passed, I realized it was also a confrontation with everything I had been forced to survive quietly. While adjusting my hair, I tried to ignore the thought that kept returning like a tide. People would be watching me. Not my son. Not his diploma. Me. They always did. In family gatherings, I had become a silhouette. Present but never centered. Tolerated but never admired. The woman who did her best, said with that tone that sounds like pity disguised as politeness. I could already imagine the sideways glances, the whispered comparisons, the subtle rewrites of history where my sacrifices became footnotes and my struggles turned into exaggerations. And then there was Raphael. His presence in my life was a gentle contradiction, a quiet miracle I never planned. He was younger, noticeably younger, and that fact alone created an invisible stage where I felt judged before any audience even existed. I wasn't ashamed of him. The shame came from the certainty that others would try to reduce what we shared to something foolish, inappropriate, temporary, a phase, a distraction, anything but what it truly was. A calm, steady companionship that honored the pieces of me no one else seemed to see. As I clasped a small necklace around my neck, I remembered the first time he noticed it. He had brushed his thumb lightly over the pendant, not to compliment me, but as if acknowledging something deeper, something worn close to the heart. That memory softened me for a moment, and I drew in a breath as though preparing for impact. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting the reality of the day settle. My son's graduation should have been purely joyful, yet beneath the surface stretched the fragile balance I had built. My relationship with Raphael, still unknown to most of the family, the silent competition my ex-husband always seemed to carry around, and the unspoken expectation that I would stay in my assigned place, modest, quiet, unremarkable. But I knew today would test every part of that structure. The thought of the auditorium made my stomach tighten. Rows of families clapping with pride, faces turned toward the stage, cameras ready to capture perfect moments. I imagined myself sitting there between worlds, between the life I had lived for decades and the one that had slowly unfolded with Raphael's arrival. Would I appear out of place? Would the whispers start as soon as we walked in together? Would people pretend not to see him, or pretend too hard that they did? I rose and smoothed the fabric of my dress. It felt like armor and vulnerability woven into one. By the time I stepped into the hallway, my pulse had settled into an uneasy rhythm. I knew the day would stretch beyond ceremonies and photographs. It would peel layers I had learned to protect. It would expose truths people preferred to ignore. And yet, beneath all the fear and anticipation, there was a quiet certainty. My son deserved every ounce of pride I carried for him. And Raphael, whether hidden or seen, was part of the world that had allowed me to stand again after so many years of bending. As I locked the door behind me, a faint breeze touched my face, carrying the scent of morning air and something else, something that felt like the edge of a change I couldn't yet name. Everything about the day already felt like a mirror, reflecting not only my son's triumph, but the long, complicated road that had led both of us there. Raphael entered my life without ceremony. without any intention of becoming anything significant. Looking back, that is perhaps why his presence unfolded with such unexpected meaning, because it was not born from grand gestures, but from simple, steady moments that accumulated like quiet dawns. Our first encounter happened in a setting so ordinary that I barely took notice of it at the time, a small community center where I attended a workshop more out of a sense of responsibility than enthusiasm. I had grown accustomed to spaces where I felt older, out of place, and invisible. He was helping organize materials, stacking chairs with an ease that made the task seem almost graceful. I remember thinking he was polite, attentive, and far too young to be paying any real attention to a woman like me. But he did. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just consistently. When I spoke, he listened without rushing to respond. When I hesitated, he waited without impatience. His presence carried a quiet awareness that made room for things I didn't even know still needed space. What struck me later wasn't the way he looked at me, but the way he saw me. People often mistake those two things as the same, but they aren't. My family looked at me and saw responsibility, duty, necessity. My ex-husband looked at me and saw someone who would absorb his failures so he wouldn't have to face them. My coworkers saw someone dependable enough to carry extra weight. Raphael, however, saw something different, something I hadn't seen in myself for years. He saw my intelligence without belittling it. He saw my exhaustion without calling it drama. He saw my scars without turning them into a spectacle. He saw my laughter as something alive, not inappropriate for my age. I grew aware of how deeply those small recognitions began to shift me. One afternoon, we ended up staying behind after an event ended. The room was half lit, scattered with chairs and papers, and the air felt heavy with the kind of silence that invites honesty. I don't remember how the conversation shifted, only that I began speaking about things I rarely shared. My fears about aging alone, my insecurities about the marks the years had etched into my skin, the exhaustion of always needing to prove I was enough. I expected the usual responses, reassurances that felt empty, or awkward attempts to change the subject. But Raphael listened the way one listens to a story they don't want to end. There was no shock in his eyes, no pity, no attempt to fix or minimize, only presence. He treated my truths with a reverence I wasn't used to, as if being trusted with them was an honor. When he eventually became part of my life in a deeper way, it wasn't because he chased me or because I needed someone. It was because something in his steadiness met something in my silence, and the connection grew naturally, without any intention to defy the world outside. Yet the world outside always finds a way to intrude. The difference in our ages became an invisible banner others were eager to raise on our behalf, as though we owed explanations for what we shared. I felt that pressure much more than he did, not because he was unaware, but because he refused to shrink to fit their assumptions. He treated the gap in our ages as a detail, not a defining feature. For him, the measure of a relationship was the quality of presence, not the arithmetic of birthdays. Still, I carried the weight of every possible judgment. The whispers, the raised eyebrows, the dismissive smirks. I anticipated them long before they appeared. Yet Raphael never wavered. He remained patient even when I tried to distance myself out of fear. He remained gentle when I questioned my worth. He remained courageous in moments when I wanted to hide. His attention wasn't the impulsive spark of someone seeking novelty. It was the enduring flame of someone who chose to stay, fully aware of what that choice meant. And that is why inviting him to my son's graduation felt like exposing a fragile truth to a storm. I wasn't afraid of Raphael embarrassing me. I was afraid of the world embarrassing us, of the glances that would try to shrink me, of the assumptions that would try to reduce him. But Raphael saw all of this long before I admitted it aloud. And still, he chose to stand beside me. What he would do at that graduation, what no one understood at first, was the natural continuation of the way he had always seen me, clearly, honestly, and without apology. Inviting Raphael to my son's graduation was not a simple gesture. It was a crossroads that forced me to confront truths I had kept quiet, even from myself. The decision lingered in my mind for days, drifting in and out like a hesitant visitor. Each time I imagined asking him, my chest tightened with a familiar fear. the fear of exposing a part of my life to an audience that had never shown mercy. My family had long mastered the art of dissecting everything I did, and I knew they would examine Raphael under a cold, unforgiving light the moment they learned of his existence. I remember sitting at the kitchen table late one evening, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. The graduation invitation lay in front of me, its embossed letters catching the light in a way that made the entire moment feel heavier. This was my son's day, a milestone shaped by every sacrifice I had made, every moment I pulled us through without applause or assistance. Raphael had been part of the recent years that restored some of the strength I thought I had lost. Yet something inside me whispered that his presence at the ceremony might cause a disturbance I wasn't ready to face. As I traced my finger along the edge of the invitation, I replayed scenarios in my mind. I imagined my ex-husband's smirk stretching wider when he saw Raphael standing beside me. I pictured relatives exchanging glances sharp enough to cut. I felt the weight of judgment that had never hesitated to declare what was appropriate for a woman at my age. Their expectations of who I should be had always been a cage disguised as advice. And beneath all this was another fear, one far more intimate. The possibility that my son might feel overshadowed or embarrassed by my choices. He had grown up navigating a family dynamic where loyalty was expected, even when it was painful, and where silence was often valued over truth. I didn't want the graduation to become a battlefield. I didn't want him to feel his day was compromised by the presence of a man younger than he expected his mother to date. Despite these thoughts, Raphael's face kept rising in my memory. His calm expression, his genuine attention, the way he created space for me to be myself without shrinking. I thought of the evenings we spent walking in quiet streets, of his voice steadying me when anxiety grew too loud, of the way he carried respect in his gestures more than most men carried in their words. If he had taught me anything, it was that companionship should not be hidden like something shameful. Still, the hesitation clung to me like a thick mist. When I finally picked up my phone, my hands were trembling. The message I drafted was brief, almost overly casual, as if minimizing the importance of the invitation would minimize the vulnerability behind it. I typed, erased, retyped. Every version felt too revealing, too hopeful, too afraid. Eventually, I settled for a simple sentence, one that carried more weight than its few words revealed. After sending it, I held the phone with both hands, waiting as though my entire life hinged on the next notification. The minutes stretched, elastic and heavy. I replayed every insecurity I had, each one rising like a wave. The lines on my face, the exhaustion in my eyes, the gap in our ages that others would weaponize against us. I wondered if inviting him would create storms he didn't deserve. Then his reply arrived. It was warm, steady, and uncomplicated, just like him. He said he would be honored to be there for me, for my son, and for a moment that symbolized so much more than a diploma. His message carried no hesitation, no concern about judgment, no attempt to negotiate conditions. He simply accepted, as if supporting me was the most natural thing in the world. I felt my breath loosen, as though I had been holding it since the moment I met him. Relief washed over me, but it came coated with an undercurrent of fear. Raphael's confidence contrasted starkly with my dread, and I couldn't help but wonder whether I had spent too many years thinking of myself through the eyes of people who never truly valued me. As the graduation day approached, I found myself preparing with meticulous care, not to impress anyone, but to gather courage. Choosing my dress felt symbolic, like selecting the version of myself I would present to a world that had already decided who I should be. Raphael's presence would challenge their narrative, and part of me feared the consequences. On the night before the ceremony, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about my son's journey, about the laughter we shared, about the times I held him while he cried, about the nights I whispered encouragement into the dark. This was his celebration, but it was also the closing of a chapter shaped by my resilience. I realized then that leaving Raphael out would mean erasing a piece of the woman I had become in these last few years. By morning, the decision felt settled in a quiet, resolute way. Inviting Raphael wasn't just an act of affection, it was an act of truth, And perhaps, after a lifetime of being minimized, I finally owed myself that. The auditorium felt larger than I remembered, with rows of seats arranged like a silent audience waiting to judge not only the graduates, but the lives that had brought them there. The air buzzed with murmured conversations, perfume, cologne, and the faint vibration of anticipation. Parents walked with hurried pride, adjusting collars and smoothing dresses, while students in caps and gowns clustered in excited groups. I stepped inside with Raphael beside me, and the world seemed to slow into a careful observation of every detail. The texture of the carpet beneath my shoes, the soft glow of stage lights warming the ceiling, the distant hum of microphones, it all merged into a single awareness of being seen. Raphael walked slightly behind me, giving me space, as though understanding that too much closeness might feel overwhelming under so many watching eyes. His presence was a quiet anchor, grounding me even as anxiety climbed into my bloodstream. We moved toward the section where families were gathering, and I recognized faces long before they recognized me. My ex-husband stood near the front, adjusting the tie of his younger partner with a familiarity that once belonged to another version of my life. The sight did not sting as it once would have. Instead, it reminded me how differently people rebuild themselves after a separation. He had rebuilt loudly. I had rebuilt silently. When he noticed Raphael at my side, there was a flicker, barely visible but unmistakable, of something sharp slipping through his composed expression. Not shock, not jealousy, something closer to annoyance, as though I had broken an unspoken rule by arriving with someone who made me appear unexpectedly alive. The seats were arranged in clusters, some clearly designated for certain groups. Families took up entire rows with confidence, expanding into the space as though claiming territory. I felt the familiar sensation of not knowing where I belonged, like an afterthought forced to fit into an arrangement already complete. Raphael sensed it. Without leaning close enough to draw attention, he directed me gently toward a pair of seats off to the side, where we could see the stage clearly, but still keep a respectful distance. It felt strategic, almost protective, as though he were creating a small sanctuary within the crowd. Even then, a few eyes lingered. People who hadn't greeted me in years suddenly found reasons to stare just long enough to confirm their suspicions before turning away with tight smiles. As the ceremony began, I tried to focus on the stage, listening to the speeches about perseverance, achievement, and bright futures. Yet my attention kept drifting to the reality unfolding around me. Some relatives avoided eye contact altogether. Others glanced repeatedly in my direction, whispering behind carefully lifted programs. Their discomfort was palpable, as if my presence with a younger man disrupted their understanding of the family hierarchy. Raphael remained steady, his posture relaxed but attentive. He didn't react to the murmurs or to the occasional glare thrown in his direction. Instead, he watched the ceremony with quiet interest, occasionally giving me a glance that carried more reassurance than words ever could. Being beside him felt like standing within a soft shield, one that absorbed the noise and left only clarity behind. When my son's name was called, a wave of emotion rose inside me so suddenly that I almost forgot everything else. He walked across the stage with the same determined stride he had as a child racing through the house, chasing dreams too big for his small body. I felt tears gather, not of sadness or pride in isolation, but of recognition. Recognition of the years woven into that moment, of the nights he studied at the kitchen table while I worked late shifts, of the times he held my hand when life felt heavier than I could carry. As applause echoed through the room, I clapped with my whole heart, and Raphael clapped too, with a sincerity that made something inside me settle. In that instant, the world shrank to what was essential: my son's achievement, my journey, and the quiet strength of the man beside me. But the moment ended quickly. After the graduates exited the stage, the room filled with a scatter of movement. Families stood, rearranging themselves for photographs. I noticed how quickly some of my relatives grouped together, securing their poses, signaling each other. The formation had a familiar structure: my ex-husband in front, his partner at his side, my parents flanking them. I approached, expecting to join, but before I could say a word, Someone gestured vaguely toward another section, directing me somewhere less central. It wasn't malicious. It was casual, practiced, the kind of exclusion that comes from habit rather than intention. But it cut deeply all the same. Raphael noticed the shift immediately. He didn't intervene or touch my arm, not wanting to provoke attention. Instead, he positioned himself slightly behind me, close enough to show solidarity, far enough to avoid becoming the focus. And in that simple gesture, I felt something change, a subtle defiance, a refusal to disappear into the margins again. I stood taller, even as the room pressed around me. The auditorium, once just a venue, had become a map of the roles people expected me to play. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the edges of those roles beginning to crack. The hallway outside the auditorium flowed with movement like a river that had suddenly burst its banks. Students in gowns posed for pictures. Relatives called out names. Flashes from cameras erupted in irregular bursts. Amid the noise, I tried to hold on to the warmth I had felt when my son crossed the stage, but the moment slipped through my fingers as quickly as it had formed. The energy in the air shifted into something more strained, more territorial, more familiar in a way I wished it wasn't. Families began arranging themselves for photos with practiced choreography, moving like groups that had rehearsed their formations years in advance. My family was among them. My ex-husband stood near the center, straight-backed, with that casual authority he had always carried, as though cameras were drawn to him by instinct. His partner stood at his side, smiling with a confidence that suggested she knew exactly where she fit, and exactly where I did not. My son approached them first, as most children do in these situations, pulled by the gravitational force of habit and history. I watched him step into their circle, adjusting his gown, looking almost guilty for leaving me a few steps behind. There was space for me, technically, but the space felt like an afterthought, the kind of opening one offers more out of obligation than desire. I moved toward them, Raphael following at a respectful distance. Before I reached the group, one of my relatives gave a polite smile and gestured vaguely for me to stand on the far side, as though organizing furniture rather than people. Their message was gentle in tone, sharp in meaning. You can be here, but not here. I could almost hear the unspoken instructions. Don't disrupt the symmetry. Don't stand too close. Don't make this complicated. I took my place where they pointed, angling myself into the frame while pretending not to notice how easily I had been nudged aside. Raphael stayed a few steps back, observing quietly. His stillness wasn't passive. It was attentive, aware. He was giving me space while also witnessing the subtle cruelty that my family believed was invisible. The first photo was taken, then another with different combinations. My son with his father, my son with his grandparents, my son with his father and grandparents. Each time someone would say, "Let's get just one more." And each time the configuration shifted in ways that gently pushed me further out of the focal point. When I was included, it felt like a pause between the real shots. When I wasn't, it felt like the natural order being restored. I tried to smile through it, stretching my mouth into something that looked polite, but every flash of the camera made the edges of that smile tremble. Watching my son move between the setups with ease, I felt a pang. Not of jealousy, but of grief. Grief for all the years when I held the pieces of his life together while others held only the glory. At one point, my mother approached me with a soft, overly sympathetic expression, the kind people wear when they want to appear kind while reinforcing your exclusion. She patted my arm lightly and whispered something about not wanting to confuse the photos, her eyes flicking toward Raphael for a fraction of a second before she quickly looked away. The message landed heavy. Not wanting to confuse the photos, not wanting to confuse the story, not wanting to confuse the role I had been assigned. I felt my breath tighten, shallow and uneven. The warm pride from earlier evaporated, replaced by the cold draft of being pushed to the margins of my own life. Then came a moment that crystallized everything. My ex-husband called out, "Let's get a family shot," with a tone that suggested he was orchestrating the entire event. People arranged themselves eagerly. When I moved closer, a cousin stepped lightly into the gap where I might have stood, filling the space with a swift, seamless motion. And no one noticed. Or maybe they did. Maybe that was the point. The frame closed without me. My son didn't mean it, but he didn't notice it either. I stood there, 2 steps outside of the picture, feeling like a ghost watching a scene she once belonged to. My chest tightened as though my ribs were folding inward, making room for the old ache. The ache of being essential but unseen, necessary but unacknowledged. Raphael saw everything. Without a word, he approached and stopped beside me, his presence grounding me in my disorientation. He didn't touch me, didn't speak, didn't intervene. He simply stood with me, matching my stillness, as though silently saying, "I see you. I see what they're doing. And I'm here." That quiet solidarity helped me breathe again. When the photos ended, the crowd began to disperse, families drifting toward the restaurant for the celebratory dinner. I watched everyone move ahead in a loose, cheerful wave while Raphael and I remained a few steps behind. The distance felt symbolic, like the space between who I had been expected to be and who I was slowly becoming. And even though the sting lingered, Raphael's presence beside me made the pain feel less like a verdict and more like a truth finally being recognized. The restaurant chosen for the celebration was elegant in a way that felt almost theatrical. Soft lighting spilling across polished tables, glassware arranged with precision, conversations rising and falling in waves. Families filled the space, creating an atmosphere of rehearsed joy and curated pride. It was supposed to be a continuation of the ceremony's warmth, but for me, the evening had already begun to unravel into something sharper. The earlier exclusion clung to my skin like a residue I couldn't wash off. We were seated at a long table, the kind that encourages hierarchy more than togetherness. My ex-husband naturally took a place near the center, where attention gathered easily around him. His partner sat beside him, glowing with the confidence of someone who felt firmly rooted in her role. My son sat nearby, torn between worlds he didn't know how to reconcile. I took a seat closer to the end of the table, and Raphael settled beside me, not out of obligation but out of intention. The conversations began with predictable rhythms, stories of college memories, jokes about the future, lightly veiled boasts from relatives who liked to attach themselves to achievement. I listened quietly, trying to let the noise wash over me, but every now and then someone would speak of the effort it took to raise a child, conveniently editing the story in ways that erased the years I spent carrying the weight alone. At one point, my ex-husband began recounting a story from our son's childhood. He described long nights helping with homework, early mornings driving him to school, weekends spent guiding him toward discipline and responsibility. As he spoke, people around the table nodded with admiration, sipping their drinks as though listening to a hero sharing his victories. I sat still, not because his story hurt, though it did, but because it was familiar. I had heard this version of events before, a narrative polished over time until fiction became memory. The truth, that he was often absent, detached, or resentful, had never interested anyone. My sacrifices were invisible because they were expected. His minimal involvement was applauded because it was optional. Raphael sensed the shift in my posture, the tension gathering in my shoulders. He glanced at me with quiet understanding, then returned his gaze to the center of the table. He didn't frown or sigh. He simply observed, absorbing the dynamic with the patience of someone who knew exactly what was happening. When the main courses were cleared, my ex-husband rose slightly in his seat and tapped his glass with a fork, calling for attention. The table fell into a shared silence, and he launched into a toast congratulating our son. His words were well-crafted, warm enough to sound genuine but structured in a way that placed him at the emotional center of the story. He spoke of lessons he had taught, values he had instilled, examples he had set. By the time he finished, the table applauded lightly, the kind of polite clapping reserved for ritual rather than emotion. And then something unexpected happened. Before I could process the moment, Raphael stood. He didn't lift his glass with flourish or clear his throat with authority. He simply rose with the same quiet confidence he carried in everyday life. The sudden shift drew eyes toward him, Not with curiosity at first, but with confusion. After all, who was he to speak? What role did he have in this story? He paused for just long enough to let the room settle, and then he began to speak, calmly, steadily, without raising his voice or seeking approval. He spoke of effort that doesn't make it into photos. He spoke of resilience that doesn't win applause. He spoke of a woman, me, who had carried responsibilities alone, who had shaped a life through sacrifice others never witnessed. He didn't use dramatic language. He didn't accuse or expose. He simply acknowledged the truth with a clarity that cut through the room like a quiet revelation. Every word honored what I had lived, what I had endured, what I had given without recognition. As he spoke, conversations at nearby tables slowed. Forks were set down. Glasses paused midair. My family stared at him with a mixture of shock and discomfort. My ex-husband's expression hardened, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. His partner blinked rapidly, trying to understand how a man younger than most people at the table had just shifted the entire dynamic with a handful of gentle truths. My cheeks warmed, not with embarrassment, but with something deeper, something that felt like being seen in a way I had forgotten was possible. His words didn't defend me. They recognized me. And that, to those who had spent years minimizing my role, felt like a disruption. When Raphael finished, he raised his glass slightly, not to claim attention, but to return it to where it belonged. To my son, to the years that shaped him, to the truth behind the story. Silence followed, not the comfortable silence of agreement, but the charged silence of people recalibrating their understanding. And in that silence, I felt a shift inside myself too. Something long dormant, something that had curled inward after years of being pushed aside, finally began to lift its head. The silence that followed Raphael's toast did not dissolve quickly. It stayed in the air like a dense fog, settling over the table with a heaviness that made every movement feel deliberate. People shifted in their chairs, adjusting silverware, clearing throats, pretending to look at menus that no one was actually reading. The quiet was not just the absence of sound, it was a recalibration, a collective attempt to make sense of what had just happened. I sat frozen for a moment, unsure where to place my hands, unsure how to interpret the pounding in my chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shame. It was something fiercer and more fragile, being seen after a lifetime of invisibility. My pulse echoed inside me like footsteps in a hollow hallway. The breed that Raphael had made was not loud, but it was honest. And honesty has a way of unsettling rooms built on narratives that were never entirely true. My ex-husband was the first to break the stillness. He lifted his glass slowly, his face stiff with a controlled smile that didn't reach his eyes. The gesture was an attempt to regain authority, to reassert his position at the center of attention. His partner followed suit, offering Raphael a polite nod that seemed forced, the kind someone gives when manners require it, but sincerity does not. The relatives at the middle of the table exchanged glances, quick, sharp movements that communicated entire paragraphs without a single word spoken. Their expressions fluctuated between confusion, disapproval, and something else that struck me deeply. Surprise that someone had dared to speak truths they had worked so hard to ignore. My son sat still, his face unreadable. His hands rested on the table, fingers intertwined, knuckles pale. He didn't look at me, nor at Raphael. He stared ahead, processing, absorbing, maybe even remembering moments he had forgotten or misunderstood. The silence around him felt different, less defensive, more introspective. I felt every gaze that drifted in my direction, even when people tried to hide it behind sips of wine or bites of steak. For years, I had been accustomed to these looks, the kind that measured, evaluated, quietly judged. But this time, they didn't land the way they used to. Raphael's words had drawn a line on the table, dividing the evening into before and after. And although the room didn't welcome that truth, it could no longer deny it. Raphael sat beside me with the same serenity he carried everywhere. His presence didn't shrink or swell with the tension. It remained constant, like a steady flame in a draft. He did not seek validation or approval. He didn't seem bothered by the stares or the awkward silence. His posture conveyed something I was not used to receiving in public: unwavering solidarity. A waiter approached timidly, checking if anyone needed refills, his cheerful script faltering when he sensed the atmosphere. People muttered responses, their voices low. The clinking of glasses felt too loud, the scrape of a chair too intrusive. Every sound seemed to magnify the discomfort. Eventually, conversations resumed, but they were fragmented, hesitant, lacking the previous ease. Some relatives began speaking about the dessert menu as though the entire universe depended on choosing between mousse and tiramisu. Others shifted topics abruptly, trying to replace the weight in the air with superficial chatter. It was almost comical how desperately they tried to restore normalcy. But the normal they were trying to restore was a version of the story where I stayed small. I noticed how two aunts leaned close, whispering behind raised hands. Their eyes darted toward me, then toward Raphael. Their expressions carried that familiar mix of condescension and disbelief, the look reserved for situations they could neither categorize nor control. One of them caught my eye and quickly looked away, guilt flickering like a candle in the wind. My father cleared his throat several times, each louder than the last, as if preparing to say something but losing courage at the final moment. He glanced at Raphael with cautious curiosity, trying to reconcile the young man at the table with the image he had formed in his mind. My mother kept her hands neatly folded, avoiding eye contact altogether, her posture stiff with something that resembled embarrassment more than disapproval. As the minutes passed, I began to feel as though the entire room existed in two different realities: the one where everyone pretended nothing had happened, and the one where everything had changed and could not be undone. The surprising part was how calm I felt. It would have been natural to wish Raphael hadn't spoken, to fear the judgment, to long for invisibility again, but instead of shrinking, I felt something loosening inside me. A knot I had carried for years began to unfurl, shedding layers of silence I didn't realize I had wrapped around myself. The discomfort in the room did not belong to me. It belonged to those who had built a world where my effort was assumed, my endurance expected, and my sacrifices taken for granted. Raphael's words had cracked that world open. Toward the end of the meal, my son stood briefly to speak with a professor who had come to congratulate him. As he stepped away, he glanced at me for a brief moment. It was quick, so quick I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching. But in that glance, there was something new. Not rejection, not embarrassment. Something like recognition wrestling with understanding. When the dinner finally ended and people stood to gather their belongings, the waves of awkwardness followed them out of the restaurant. Some avoided us entirely. Others murmured brief goodbyes without meeting my eyes. A few offered stiff smiles to Raphael, masking discomfort behind politeness. But I walked out of that room different from how I had entered. Not because of the judgment I had feared, but because of the truth that had finally been given a voice. And when Raphael and I stepped into the cold night air, the silence between us was not heavy. It was freeing. The morning after the graduation dinner began quietly, with muted light filtering through the blinds and settling over the living room like a soft, hesitant apology. For a moment, I lay still on the couch, listening to the silence. It wasn't peace. It was anticipation. That charged quiet that comes before the consequences of a truth that has finally been spoken. My phone lit up before I even reached for it. Then again, and again. Notifications stacked themselves in neat rows on the screen. Messages, missed calls, voice notes. I already knew what they contained before opening a single one. Families have a way of rewriting events at record speed, especially when a narrative threatens to slip from their control. The brinde that Raphael made had rippled through the family overnight, shifting perspectives in ways they were desperate to realign. I opened the first message cautiously. It was from an aunt, written with that overly polite tone she always used when she wanted to disguise criticism as concern. She said Raphael's toast had been unexpected and slightly inappropriate for the occasion, and she hoped I didn't feel uncomfortable because people didn't understand his intentions. The wording was gentle, the meaning was not. What she really meant was, he spoke truths we didn't want to hear, and now we don't know where to place you. The next message was harsher, disguised less carefully. It came from a cousin who rarely contacted me unless there was drama to dissect. She hinted that Raphael had made the night awkward and suggested he was trying to impress people or insert himself in a story that wasn't his. It was absurd, but predictable. People often interpret sincerity as performance when they are unaccustomed to witnessing honesty. A third message came from my mother. Short, reserved, polite, too polite. We should talk when you have time. No emojis, no warmth, just enough distance to say everything she wasn't saying. I set the phone down, my fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the slow ache of disappointment. That ache was familiar, though. I had carried it for years, not from strangers, but from the people who claimed to know me best. The only thing missing was a message from my son. Hours passed before he reached out. His message came in the early afternoon, a short text asking if we could meet. My stomach fluttered with uncertainty. The heaviness of the evening before expanded inside me. Would he resent Raphael for speaking up? Would he feel embarrassed by the gesture? Would he blame me for letting the night spiral into attention he hadn't asked for? Raphael, noticing my restless pacing, approached with quiet steadiness. He didn't ask what was wrong. He already knew. He didn't offer advice or reassurance. He simply existed near me, present without expectation. His silence was not avoidance. It was support in its purest form, offering space without stepping away. He brewed tea, placing the cup in front of me with a gentle motion, then sat beside me on the couch. The cushions sank slightly under his weight, and I felt a warmth spread through the room. That warmth reminded me that love, when steady and mature, doesn't react to storms. It weathers them. When I eventually left to meet my son, my pulse throbbed with a mixture of dread and hope. The cafe he chose was quiet, tucked into a corner of the city where conversations softened into privacy. He was waiting by the window, his graduation cap resting on the table like a symbol of a moment that should have been uncomplicated. He looked tired, not physically, but emotionally, the kind of tired that comes from reevaluating truths. We greeted each other warmly, but even his hug carried a cautious undertone. As we sat, I noticed he kept adjusting the sleeves of his jacket, a nervous habit he had since childhood. The gesture softened me instantly. The conversation began slowly, with comments about the ceremony, the food, the restaurant. He circled around the topic like someone approaching a wound. When he finally spoke about the toast, his voice was careful, steady, deliberate. He told me he had been surprised, not by Raphael's presence, but by the clarity of his words. He admitted the toast unsettled him at first, not because it embarrassed him, but because it forced him to confront things he had never fully understood. He had grown up inside the family narrative, one where the loudest voices shaped the truth. Last night, for the first time, someone had shown him a version of the story that didn't match what he had been told. He confessed feeling torn, unsure how to react in the moment. But then he said something that caught my breath mid-air. He told me he had spent the night thinking about everything. About me. About the years he saw but didn't fully comprehend. About the moments when he mistook my exhaustion for overreaction because others had framed it that way. He admitted that Raphael's words made him see me differently, not as the supporting character in the family's narrative, but as the axis around which his childhood truly turned. He wasn't angry at Raphael. He was grateful. The weight in my chest loosened, replaced by a spreading warmth that felt like healing in motion. My son reached across the table, placing his hand over mine. A simple gesture, yet one that mended something deep and long-standing. We talked for a long time, and when we parted, the tension inside me felt lighter. Later, when I returned home, Raphael opened the door with a calm smile, and in that moment, I understood something essential. People can twist stories. They can distort truths. They can rewrite the past. But they cannot undo honesty spoken with integrity. Raphael had done what no one else had ever dared to do. He had given my story back to me. In the days that followed my conversation with my son, a quiet shift began to settle around me. a subtle realignment of truths that had long been buried beneath the noise of other people's versions of my life. The heaviness of the graduation dinner still clung to certain corners of my thoughts, but something softer had begun to emerge, like light filtering through curtains after a long night. My son had asked to meet again, this time at our favorite park, where the paths wound gently between tall trees and the air carried the scent of damp leaves. It was a place where we had walked countless times when he was younger, his small hand gripping mine as he told me about school projects, friendships, and dreams. Returning to that place now, with him as an adult, felt like stepping into a memory while creating a new one. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting on a bench beneath a canopy of branches. He looked calm, but not in the distant, controlled way he often adopted at family gatherings. This calmness was different, thoughtful, present. As I approached, he stood and offered a gentle, almost timid smile, the kind he used to wear when he knew he had something important to say and wanted to soften the impact before speaking. We began walking, falling into an easy rhythm. For a while, we talked about simple things: the cool weather, the noisy geese near the pond, the joggers weaving between people on the path. I could sense him gathering courage, his pauses longer than usual, his glances toward me more purposeful. And then, without ceremony, he began. He said he had been thinking constantly since the dinner, not only about Raphael's toast, but about everything he had witnessed growing up, moments he hadn't fully understood at the time, moments that now returned with a clarity sharpened by adulthood. He spoke of nights when he found me working late, of mornings when I rushed him to school while holding back exhaustion, of holidays where I seemed to carry both the weight of celebration and the quiet burden of absence. He told me he had always admired me, but he didn't realize how much of the story he had inherited from others was incomplete. He admitted that he had absorbed certain narratives without questioning them, stories whispered during family gatherings, comments muttered under breath, jokes made at my expense that he had laughed at without recognizing the sting behind them. Hearing him say this didn't hurt the way I feared it might. Instead, it felt like a release, like a knot in my chest loosening thread by thread. He went on to say that Raphael's words had unsettled him not because they were inappropriate, but because they were undeniable. They had cut through the curated stories that had been built around our family for years. He confessed that seeing someone defend my truth so directly had forced him to confront how often he had stayed silent, unsure of how to challenge the biases around him. As he spoke, I felt a blend of pride and sorrow. Pride in the man he was becoming, in his willingness to reevaluate what he thought he knew. Sorrow for the child he once was, caught in the crossfire of adults who assumed their version of reality was absolute. We sat on a bench near the water, watching ducks glide across the surface. The air was cool, but I felt warm inside, enveloped by the sincerity in his voice. He turned to me then, and I saw something in his expression that I hadn't seen before: resolve. He said he no longer cared about the opinions of relatives who clung to outdated expectations. He said he had realized that truth didn't belong to the loudest voice, but to the one willing to stand by it. He admitted he had been uncertain about Raphael at first, not because of his age, but because he feared seeing me hurt again. But seeing the way Raphael stood beside me, the way he acknowledged my sacrifices without diminishing me, had shifted something inside him. He told me he supported us, not as an obligation, but as a choice grounded in recognition, respect, and understanding. The words settled inside me like a balm. I felt my eyes grow warm, but I didn't cry. Instead, there was a quiet peace that rooted itself in my chest, deeper than gratitude. When we stood to walk back, he slipped his arm around my shoulders, an easy, natural gesture, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. In that moment, the space between mother and son felt bridged in a way that had little to do with the past and everything to do with the future. Raphael joined us for dinner that evening. The interaction between them was gentle, unforced. My son spoke to him with an ease I had never seen before, asking thoughtful questions, listening with genuine engagement. The conversation flowed without tension, and I realized something profound. The shift that had begun at the graduation dinner was not only painful, it was necessary. By the time the night ended, I understood that although the family had reacted with discomfort, dismissiveness, and whispered judgments, my son had chosen a different path. He had chosen honesty over convenience, recognition over tradition. And in doing so, he had given me something I had longed for without knowing how to ask. A place in my own life that no longer needed to apologize for existing. The next family gathering happened sooner than I expected. It wasn't a major holiday or a formal event, just a casual lunch my mother insisted on hosting, as though convinced that bringing everyone together in a familiar setting would smooth the rough edges left by the graduation dinner. But gatherings, no matter how small, have a way of revealing truths people try to hide. When I entered the house, the smell of roasted vegetables and herbs drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the soft clatter of dishes. Family members moved around the living room with practiced familiarity, but the moment they saw me, the atmosphere shifted, subtly, like a breeze brushing through curtains. Some offered warm smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Others gave stiff nods, their gazes flicking briefly toward the doorway, expecting or dreading the arrival of Raphael. A few pretended not to see me at all, too focused on rearranging chairs or adjusting settings at the table. The air hummed with unspoken questions. Raphael arrived a few minutes after me, carrying a small box of pastries as a gesture of gratitude. The room stilled almost imperceptibly when he stepped in. Not dramatically, just enough for the energy to change texture. My mother greeted him with polite restraint, her movements careful, as though trying to maintain composure while navigating unfamiliar territory. We took our seats at the long wooden table. I noticed immediately how the arrangement was different this time. Instead of being nudged toward the periphery, I found myself near the center. An adjustment so subtle I might have missed it if I hadn't spent years being gently displaced. My son sat beside me, intentionally, not out of habit but with a quiet statement of solidarity. The meal began with the kind of conversation people use to fill silence. Comments about the weather, work, small errands. Plates were passed, glasses filled. But beneath the gentle clinking of silverware, a tension simmered. It wasn't the sharp, cutting discomfort of the graduation dinner. It was something more fragile, an attempt to rebuild a structure that no longer functioned the way it once had. At one point, an uncle asked Raphael a question about his career. Phrased politely but laced with the curiosity of someone trying to understand how a young man like him fit into the family tableau. Raphael answered with his usual calm, offering just enough detail without turning the moment into a performance. His voice carried no defensiveness, no eagerness to impress, just sincerity. That sincerity unsettled some of them. My ex-husband was not present, but his absence hovered like a shadow, freeing the room in some ways, tightening it in others. Without him there to command attention, the hierarchy felt less rigid. Conversations shifted more naturally, and people addressed me directly rather than speaking around me. It was strange, almost disorienting, to feel included in a way that didn't require squeezing myself into a space that had never been shaped for me. As the lunch progressed, I watched small, telling moments unfold. A cousin who had ignored me at the graduation asked me about my work with genuine interest. An aunt who had criticized Raphael quietly refilled his glass without being prompted. My father asked him a thoughtful question, listening without interruption. None of these gestures erased the past, but they indicated something new, a recognition, however hesitant, that the narrative had shifted. My son played an unexpected role in the transformation. Whenever conversation veered toward dismissiveness or subtle condescension, he gently redirected it, offering context or gratitude, placing emphasis on truths that had long been minimized. He didn't confront anyone directly. Instead, he held the space with a maturity that surprised even me. And beneath the surface of the lunch, I sensed something unfolding, a quiet redistribution of power. I had spent years at this table shrinking, adjusting, making myself easier to absorb. But this time, I sat differently. Not taller in posture, but sturdier in presence. Raphael's quiet strength at my side, combined with my son's renewed understanding, had become an invisible shield, not to protect me from conflict, but to reflect back the truth that I was no longer willing to hide. Near the end of the meal, my mother asked Raphael about the toast he made at the graduation. Her tone was cautious, perhaps even apprehensive. The table fell silent for a moment, waiting for tension, expecting the awkwardness to return. But Raphael answered softly, simply. He explained that he had spoken because he believed honesty mattered more than appearances, that honoring someone's effort was never inappropriate, that stories deserved to be told with accuracy and compassion. His words were not defensive. They were grounding. My mother nodded, her expression shifting, just a fraction, from guarded to contemplative. It was the smallest of changes, but I felt it as profoundly as if the walls themselves had moved. When the gathering finally ended and people rose from the table, the usual flurry of polite farewells felt different. Some relatives hugged me longer than usual. Others shook Raphael's hand with more sincerity. The cracks in the old structure had widened, not through confrontation, but through presence, through a steady, unwavering truth that could no longer be ignored. As Raphael and I walked toward the car, my son caught up to us, slipping his hand briefly around my shoulder. The gesture was quiet, almost casual, but it carried the weight of everything we had gained. The table was no longer the same, and neither was I. The days after the family lunch unfolded with a gentleness I wasn't used to. Soft mornings with quiet sunlight, evenings where conversations flowed without tension, and moments when life felt less like a performance and more like something lived in its purest form. Nothing dramatic happened, nothing monumental. Instead, there was a gradual settling, the way dust drifts to the ground after a long disturbance, a stillness that wasn't silence, but understanding. The turning point, subtle yet unmistakable, came on a Saturday morning when my son invited Raphael and me to join him for a small community event at the university. It wasn't a ceremony or a family gathering, just a casual afternoon with food stalls, music, and alumni catching up under colorful banners strung between trees. The invitation itself carried a significance I didn't need explained. It wasn't about formality, it was about inclusion, about recognizing the shape of our life as something whole, legitimate, and no longer hidden at the edges. When we arrived, the campus was alive with movement. Children ran between tables, students handed out flyers, volunteers set up games, and the sound of laughter blended with the distant rhythm of live music. The air carried the scent of grilled food, fresh grass, and warm pavement. My son waved when he spotted us, his smile unguarded, free of the tension he had worn at the graduation dinner. We walked together through the event, stopping at booths, sampling bites of food, listening to short performances. My son engaged Raphael in conversations easily, asking about his experiences, telling stories from his own life, making room for him not as a guest, but as someone who belonged by my side. I felt myself watching the two of them more than I watched anything happening around us, observing the fluid, natural way they interacted, the subtle respect in my son's tone, the way Raphael listened without overstepping. There was a moment when a colleague of my son approached us, smiling politely, asking who Raphael was. My son answered before I could, introducing him without hesitation, without awkwardness, without lowering his voice or shifting his posture. The simplicity of his words struck me with unexpected force. "This is Raphael," he said, "someone important to my mom, and to us. To us." The phrase echoed in me with a slow, powerful warmth. It wasn't about defining the relationship. It was about acknowledging it without shame, without justification. My son had given me something I had never received from anyone else in my family. Validation grounded in truth, rather than performance. As the afternoon faded into a milder light, we found ourselves near a small garden area on campus. People wandered nearby, talking and laughing, but the space around us felt almost secluded. The three of us stood close, listening to the distant hum of music, and for a moment, everything felt aligned in a way that was both ordinary and extraordinary. My son looked at me then, not the quick, apologetic glances from before, but a steady, grounded look. He thanked me for everything I had done for him, Not in a dramatic speech, but in a simple sentence that carried years of recognition. Then he turned to Raphael, expressing gratitude for supporting me with humility and strength. Raphael nodded, offering a soft smile, never trying to claim a spotlight. As we talked, I noticed something shifting around us, not in the environment, but in the way people saw us. Passers-by glanced our way and smiled politely. No stares, no confusion, no whispered commentary. The difference in our ages, once a glaring spotlight that magnified every insecurity, had faded into the background, losing the authority it once held over my life. It wasn't that people stopped noticing. It was that I stopped needing their approval to exist fully. Later, as we walked back to the parking lot, I felt a sense of calm settle into my bones. Calm not born from resignation, but from acceptance. Raphael walked beside me with that familiar steadiness, and my son walked on my other side, matching our pace. In that simple alignment, I felt something profound, a sense of belonging I had never dared to expect. The world around us moved in its usual rhythm. Cars passing, leaves rustling in the breeze, conversations drifting through the air. Yet, within that ordinary moment, something extraordinary had happened. The difference in age between Raphael and me had once been the loudest part of our story. It had dictated how others saw us, how they reacted, how I doubted myself. But now, the narrative had changed. The difference was still there, visible and undeniable. It simply no longer held the microphone. What spoke louder instead were the things that had always mattered more. The consistency of Raphael's presence, the honesty in my son's acceptance, the truth of the life I had built despite everything. That evening, after dropping my son off, Raphael and I sat briefly in the car before driving home. The sky was turning a soft shade of twilight, the horizon washed in fading pink. I watched the light shift across his face, and he looked at me with that same quiet expression he always carried, the one that felt like home. No words were needed. None would have captured the fullness of the moment anyway. The world was still the same. But I wasn't, and neither was the story people told about me. As we pulled onto the road, I rested my hand lightly on Raphael's, feeling the warmth of a future no longer defined by fear or judgment. A future built on truth, recognition, and a love that had survived not because it was loud, but because it was steady. A love that no longer cared who counted the years. A love that finally felt free to exist in the open. A love where time, at last, no longer commanded anything.